welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for everyone who's interested and active in the field of depth and Jungian psychologies. And my guest today is Naomi Ruth Lowinsky, who is an analyst member of the San Francisco C.G. Jung Institute, and she's also a widely published poet. Naomi's recent memoir, The Sister from Below, When the Muse Gets Her Way, tells stories of her pushy muse, she says. Naomi is also the author of the Motherline, Every Woman's Journey to Find Her Female Roots, and in addition, the author of 3 books of poetry, the most recent of which is called Adagio Lamentation, and features lots of poems about her own grandmother, who was a refugee from Shoah and also a fine painter. And Naomi says that her grandmother taught her the practice of making art of one's life, which is really beautiful. Now, Naomi has written many essays in what she considers her Jungian memoir mode, which we will hear more about in this interview, I hope. And those essays have been published in Psychological Perspectives and in the Jung Journal. And she also teaches and lectures, and she's the winner of the Obama Millennium Award for a poem about Obama's grandmother. So that seems to be a theme in her writing as well. Maybe we'll hear some about that. Naomi, thank you so much for being with me. It's really a great pleasure to speak with you. Welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Bonnie. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm excited to dig into this because, you say that your book, The Sister from Below, When the Muse Gets Her Way, really speaks to people who want to cultivate the unlived promise of their creativity. And it's for those who are on a spiritual path, anybody who's interested in a Jungian approach to life, and also to those who are filled with the urgency of poems that have to be written, with paintings that must be painted, and with journeys that yearn to be taken. And I just want to say I found this to be so true for me. I mean, your book is it's sprinkled with poetry, both yours and also that of other poets that have inspired you. And,
right.
It's almost like a garden where flowers are just scattered everywhere, all the different colors and different kinds. And in fact, it kind of reminded me of a book that was one of my absolute favorites when I was a kid called The Secret Garden.
That was a favorite of mine, too.
Absolutely gorgeous. And it's, again, it's like opening the book was kind of like opening the gate and having this amazing sort of secret place that just opens up into a whole other world where I could really lose myself. And I felt that your poetry, as well as the book, is just a doorway to that kind of a space or a place. And you talk about how, in fact, you credit the fact that your muse is the one who kind of opened this door for you. So would you just talk about your relationship to the muse? How do you describe a muse, and how did you develop a relationship with her in your life?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your beautiful description. I love having the sister be a garden. That's great. I had a very specific experience that made me aware of the muse with me. I was recently certified as an analyst, and I had promised myself that I would be going back to writing poetry. I had been focusing on my clinical work and on becoming an analyst. And but I was going to write a paper for a Jungian conference, and of course I wanted it to be brilliant, and I sat down and started writing, and I got stopped, and nothing was coming. And then I heard this voice, and I knew the voice was not me, and the voice said, "You promised me poems. It's time for poetry." And I thought, well, who are you? And and I said, but I'm a Jungian analyst now. I have to speak to the analyst. And she said, well, and it was a woman's voice very clearly, you can do both. And I said, well, where do I start? And she said, start by writing about the conflict. That was the beginning of The Sister from Below, which is writing about the sister who pays attention to what Jung would have called in the Red Book, and of course I hadn't read the Red Book yet, the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths, who is the muse, or my muse is the spirit of the depths.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up the Red Book. I hope we can talk about that because in reading your book, I see some really wonderful and tremendous synchronicities and correlations between your experience, as you describe it, and what happened to Jung when he began to also have a relationship with these different characters or entities or symbols, whatever you want to call them, that started showing up in his life, one of which was a woman, by the way, who he ultimately described as his anima, as I'm sure you know.
Right, right.
That's really interesting to me. I just want to quote one thing that you say in the book, which you've just alluded to, and I hope that you'll sort of go more in this direction for a few minutes. And that is, you say at one point, as this muse or this voice showed up for you, you tried to fend her off, and she was causing all kinds of difficulties in your life because of her demands. And I really love the way that you describe it. But you say, I drew a line in the sand, psychology on one side and the safe side, the good side, poetry on the other side, dangerous, wild. So can you talk about that transition to actually, giving over to this, maybe not seductive voice, but certainly something that compelled you in a different direction from your everyday activities?
Well, the muse or the sister from below or the spirit of the depths, as Jung experienced it, doesn't really care about your everyday life and doesn't care if the kids get fed or if dinner gets made or if the bills get paid. I mean, it's just it's this powerful energy from a much deeper level that's not about the personal individual life. It's, Jung, I guess, would call it the self or soul. He had this meeting with his soul in the Red Book, and it, as you say, it was just so astounding to me to finally be able to read the Red Book and see that I was working in the mode of the Red Book without even having read it. That confrontation with the soul who really doesn't care about your small individual life, but cares about the life of the ages and brings the life of the ages into your consciousness, but is going to rip you up if you don't pay attention to her, may rip you up if you pay attention to her as well, because she's dangerous.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. As you say, Jung referred to some of these experiences as the spirit of the depths, and
right.
I find it really interesting that you call her the sister from below, because truly she is bringing something. I don't know, actually, maybe this is a question for you, and that is, was your experience more about her coming up and sort of intruding in your everyday life, or was it more about you actually going to the place where she exists? How did you interpret that or experience that?
Well, I feel like she intrudes. But I'll tell you, early on, before I became a therapist or an analyst, I went to live in the world of the sister from below without having that terminology. I was a very intuitive kind of feeling person, and I was writing poetry, and I was a single mom with 3 kids, and I was just kind of swept over. I tell some of those stories in The Sister from Below, these very powerful archetypal forces. And luckily, I got myself into Jungian Analysis, where my analyst kept saying, you got to be grounded. He was helping me develop an ego to deal with all of this. And so it was very, very important to develop an ordinary life and to pay attention to feeding the kids and myself and to pay attention to making money so I could pay the bills. All that kind of stuff of the ego was essential. But then the sister came back, and, when you have an ego, then you really feel how assaultive she is, so how inspiring and exciting and passion-making she is.
What do you think, Naomi, is the relationship between the muse, as you call her, and of course you go through a pretty detailed history of how the muse has shown up in various philosophers and poets throughout the ages. I'm curious how you think the muse relates to the concept of soul, because James Hillman, and of course we've just lost him, and he was
yes, we did,
and huge contributor to not only Jungian psychology but extending Jungian psychology into something that was very, I think, contemporary and relevant to this day and age. He talks about the anima as being soul or meaning soul. And he says that a person can converse with the anima in the same way that a poet talks with his muse, that a philosopher talks with his daimon, that a mystic talks with his tutelary angel, or that a madman actually talks with his hallucinations. So I'm curious if you can, it may be just recounting some of the history and the research that you did as you began to look into this very interesting and unusual phenomenon that was occurring to you, just the relationship between muse and soul. And again, we see in Jung's Red Book, as we mentioned, that some of these figures were actually showing up as what some people might call hallucinations.
Right. That's a beautiful quote from Hillman, and I'm pleased that you bring him in, because he offered so much to our world and was such a great contributor. And he was so much about the literary and the creative side of Jungian psychology. But for me, in my experience, the muse is a shapeshifter, and I always think of the fact that the word soul and psyche are the same word. So when we talk about our psyches, we're really talking about our souls. A lot of my work as an analyst, and certainly my work as an analyst, my own psyche, has been to listen to all the different voices that speak. And one of the things I love about Jung is that he doesn't see that in a negative way or doesn't pathologize it. That's our aliveness. And then, of course, when we actually read the Red Book, we get the immediacy and the fieriness and the terrifying quality of that intense internal experience that Jung called the reality of the psyche. So the reality of my psyche is that I have these inner figures, and some of them are male and some of them are female, but what I experience as supporting my creativity often is a female figure, and she takes many different forms. In Sister from Below, she shows up as the Sister from Below, and then she shows up as Eurydice, and she shows up as a grandmother who died in the Shoah before I was born and who pushes me to read poets of the Shoah, so she takes the form of ghosts as well. Of course, Jung is beset by ghosts, as we know. So I worry about getting too worried about the edges and the distinctions of these words. For me, they're very fluid, and I use them quite poetically, and I don't really want to distinguish between psyche, soul, anima. They kind of move in and out of each other, and they change shape.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's funny because as you're saying that, I'm getting the distinct impression that they don't want to be defined like that either.
They do not want to be defined, exactly. Thank you.
There's something very transitional in the form. Like you said, it's really the archetype of shape-shifting and this capacity to be so
right.
fluid and not pinned down by our language and our desire, our very human desire to put labels on things. I like that. It makes it a very living process. Did you find, Naomi, in your work with the muse, and I guess it's ongoing work because they don't tend to disappear when they have
No, it's certainly ongoing.
How did you find that you actually engaged with the Sister from Below? Was it really what Jung refers to as active imagination? Did you have your own process?
Yes, Jung really was very, very helpful with the concept of active imagination for me. And my version of doing it, and I really, really developed this after I finished my second analysis and I no longer had that other person listening to me and engaged with me. And sometimes I needed help. And I learned, I think it was shortly after the end of my second analysis, and of course I spent so many years in analysis, and it was so helpful to me, that I had a dream of a dark-skinned woman who was preparing me for a wedding. And I had no idea who she was. And so I decided, well, I'm going to talk to her. And the way I talked to her was actually in writing because I'm a writer. So I sat down and I wrote the dream out. And then I said, dark woman, who are you? And she said, my name is Sophia. And my father is Greek and my mother is African. And I'm here to guide you since you're done with your analysis. Now all you have to do is talk to me when you have a problem. And she still is available to me. She's a wonderful analyst. She doesn't cost anything except time and some writing. And she always has this other point of view that comes from the psyche, from what Jung calls the objective psyche, which is, she says things that make total sense when I think about them, but I certainly wasn't thinking it before she said it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great example of how the psyche can come to the fore. Again, Jung, of course, his whole idea of the collective unconscious is that it's unconscious, but there's such a tremendous, vast wealth of help and resources there for us to give us guidance and help us figure out what the heck we're doing here and how we can really contribute our gifts to the world. And so there has to be a medium in order for these messages to come through. And certainly dreams are huge, of course, not only in the Jungian world, but in the world of art and poetry. I suspect that people have been inspired by dreams in these realms. For me, I'm not a poet by any means, but I do love to write. And I often find that writing is actually a method in which these kinds of things can come through me. And so I'm curious about your practice of writing. You refer to it as a spiritual practice. Can you talk about why you feel it is that and how anybody who likes to write or would like to write can actually develop a writing practice?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite simple. It begins by it's like any kind of practice. Like if you have a meditation practice, you have to put some time aside to meditate, and you have to make sure you have that time, whether it be every morning or every evening. And it has to be kind of sacred time. So I think that anybody who's interested in a writing practice just needs to set aside some sacred time, and it can be as little as 15, 20 minutes. Sometimes that's all I have in the morning. For me, mornings are the sacred time. And I just sit down with my notebook. I always have a dedicated notebook, and I might meditate just for a few minutes to get down deep into myself. And then I write whatever comes up. It could be about a dream. It could be about a feeling. It could be an image that's been tugging at me. But I just give that inner voice space on the page. And then I just let it be. I don't try to work with it too much until a few weeks. I kind of go back and look at it later. I want to allow it to just be itself and not to bring too much critical thinking to it, too much rationality to it. And often something will emerge, that has real energy and that begins to insist, has a voice of its own and begins to insist. And if you listen to poets talk, they talk about what the poem wants. They see, many poets that I know, see the poem as having a life of its own that begins demanding things of the poet.
Yeah, that's really an interesting process, how that comes through. And most of us in our daily lives, we get so caught up, it's really easy to turn a blind ear.
Right.
Because I think those muses, our soul, our psyche, is constantly trying to get our attention. And it seems like the faster this world moves and the more caught up we are in the day-to-day things like email and texting and just even the day-to-day things like taking care of children and household duties and jobs and responsibilities that you mentioned. It's really easy to put that to the side, but sometimes there are events or things that just absolutely grab our attention and demand, as you say, an audience.
Yes.
And at that point, a lot of times it's still easy to just say, well, I don't know what that was, or to dismiss what we call a big dream or a numinous dream and say, well, it was just a dream, I'll think about it later, and then just to go on. At least I'm speaking for myself perhaps a bit. But I just wonder how, if we don't set aside that sacred time, as you suggested, that we will ever be able to really get in touch with these kind of things that are coming through. It just seems like it's so critical to make the sacred time, or else we're basically turning our back on a gift that has been given to us.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's very hard to pay attention to that. Jung says somewhere, it might be in his book on alchemy, he describes the act of imagination and how this little voice will say something and then the rest of him says, oh, that's just nonsense. I'm not going to pay any attention to that. Why should I bother with that? And then he has to stop himself and listen again to the little voice and really take it seriously and engage with it. And as you say, we're so pulled into these extroverted activities that take us away from our core and from our essence. Something's going to happen to people if they really ignore it. It's going to be an illness. There's going to be an emotional crisis. There's going to be a terrifying dream.
Yes, because there's something that must be expressed. And
right.
It's going to be expressed one way or another. So if we tend to ignore it, there's also a quote from Jung somewhere that says, bidden or unbidden,
yes,
the gods will show up.
Exactly.
The idea
called
is
or not called, the gods will show up.
There you go. That's it, yeah. Yeah. Well, Naomi, you talk about what you consider your Jungian memoir mode, and I really enjoyed so much reading about your time in Bulgaria that you spent discovering some important symbols in your own life. Can you talk about Jungian memoir and what that means to you?
Yeah, our culture is so full of memoir, and some of them are just wonderful, but most of them deal with the outer life. And I think of Jungian memoir, and I think there's a lot of people writing nowadays who are in the Jungian world, as that kind of a memoir that also includes the inner life, dreams, visions. A Jungian memoir would not only be about how you relate to the spirit of the times, but how you relate to the spirit of the depths, and would bring that kind of consciousness into view and be interested in that kind of consciousness. It's really a different consciousness than the rest of the culture holds.
What do you think, if you're willing to speak about it, was the seed of this in your own life? Do you remember the first time that you were drawn to these types of topics, or the first time that you knew you wanted to be a Jungian analyst, or the first time that you read Jung, or the first time that the Muse appeared, the spirit of the depths appeared in your life? What was it for you that actually drew you to this kind of work and this kind of writing?
Well, I was in crisis, to give an example of what I was just talking about. I had recently come back from India. I had 3 children. My marriage had no life in it, my first marriage. I didn't know that yet. And a friend of mine said that her mother, who was seeing a Jungian, I wasn't quite sure what a Jungian was, but was seeing a Jungian, was going to a conference and was inviting she and I to go with her to this conference, which was called Forgotten Feminine. And I thought, what in the world is that? But, I wanted to spend a day away from the kids and be with my friend and her mom, whom I knew from the time I was a child and loved. And so off we went to this conference at the University of California. And there were these 3 or maybe 4, I'm not quite sure, very distinguished-looking women who were Jungian analysts. Among them were Elizabeth Osterman, who was one of the founders of the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and Kay Bradway, who's over 100 now, and who is also a member of the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and a couple of other women. And I had a very, very frightening dream just before I went to this conference. And in the dream, my 3-year-old daughter's head was severed from her body, and my mother's voice said, "You'll never get her together again." And I thought something terrible was about to happen to my daughter because I was taking the dream literally. As I sat listening to these beautiful, intelligent, mature women talk about their women patients and their women patients' creativity, I suddenly realized that the dream was about me and that I was in trouble. And I turned to my friend's mother and I said, "Who is this Jungian you're seeing?" And that's how I got myself into Jungian analysis.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. And of course, I had goosebumps when you shared the dream. And I think the reason that has such power for me, just in this moment on hearing that, is, again, it's almost a poetic image of something that was a message coming through the dream that was really reaching out to you and created a pretty remarkable change in your life because it put you on a path that you may not have found at that place and time if you hadn't paid attention to the dreams and given it the honor that was due.
But, it was one of, people who don't pay attention to dreams, and I was a person who wasn't paying attention to dreams, when you have a scary dream like that, sometimes it comes and clobbers you over the head.
Yeah, it does.
That one really did. And it was a synchronicity that I happened to be going to this conference. I imagine that my psyche used that opportunity to wake me up.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And I suspect that everybody listening to this can probably relate to that one way or another. All of us have had dreams that have had that kind of power and energy around them and probably on many levels stimulated us or was the catalyst to do something that we may not have done otherwise. So perhaps you were scheduled to go to that conference anyway, but going into it with sort of this loaded feeling of emotion and energy was probably something that put you on a very different path than.
It absolutely did. It totally changed my life. I mean, I left the marriage. I began writing poetry. I entered a Jungian analysis. I started studying psychology. Everything changed.
Yeah. So I'm curious because we can see how clearly poetry, which is inspired by the Muse, can actually change us personally, especially if we open ourselves to it and allow it. And I'm really curious about its impact on culture because the world we're living in today is really difficult. There's a lot going on that's very hard to understand, and it's hard sometimes to see how to change some of the things that seem to be going downhill very quickly and some of the suffering and the difficult challenges people are going through. One of the sections in your book is called Can Poetry Change the World? And I love that because it's a really good question. And I want to pose that to you and ask if you can talk about how poetry transforms and heals.
Well, that's a big question. Well, I think poetry changes the world at the level of poetry. It changes the world at the level of symbol and image. And I think when I'm writing a poem, I'm changed by the writing of the poem. And hopefully people who read poems that speak to them very deeply are changed by the reading of the poem. I know that many poems that are important to me have changed me. They have made me a different person by reading them. I think that poets, because they speak, well, the poets that I like speak to the spirit of the depths as well as the spirit of the times, are bringing a kind of consciousness together that Jung would maybe call the transcendent function, which brings the collective unconscious and the consciousness of the time into connection with a third thing, which is the poem. And if we have that connection between the ancient and the new, I think that is a much more whole place from which to live our lives, and that we all need to be open to that. And I'm hoping if people can be more open to that, that there's a change in consciousness at a larger level. I don't think that poetry changes the world in an immediate political sense, much as we might wish that it would,
Yeah, although I can imagine how the world might be different if every single one of our leaders and even us as individuals who are living, supporting the collective culture on whatever level we are, just by either revolting or not revolting or going with the status quo or whatever it is that we're doing. Imagine if every person were to read a poem before making big decisions or before coming together in a meeting, or I think just the mood that it creates, again, the doorway that it opens into this garden, this different space, could be a really powerful way to create a new container before some of these big decisions are made or big activities take place. It would change the world, I think.
Well, that's a profound thing you're saying. I think that would be wonderful.
Okay, so we'll lobby for that.
We're in agreement about that. Let's
poetry and government. How about that for a concept?
Yeah, right.
Well, I wonder, Naomi, if you would, because the book is just so powerful to read, and I think it's so much more powerful to hear poetry read out loud. I wonder if you would to read something for us, one of your poems that you particularly like or that speaks to you, or through you, I should say.
That's a good way of putting it. Yes, I'd be happy to. This is a poem. It's both published in one of my books of poetry, Crimes of the Dreamer, and it's also in The Sister from Below, because it's really a description of the Sister from Below in a form in which she came to me in a dream. And it's her shadowy aspect, her aspect of kind of exploding this smaller version of myself as a nice person and enlarging me to be not such a nice person. So it's called The Woman You're Not. The woman you're not is sure of her great-breasted body, mermaid to this one, siren to that. Each step of the dance and her voice from the deep of her belly, how she flings it about like her long, fiery hair, her laugh that collides with the stars. Fear never touches her, whose dreams rise up like sap, and any man who knows her teeth and the back of her hand. She grows crystals at the bottom of your garden, wears purple silk and lavender chiffon, travels in a green and yellow covered wagon drawn by 7 giraffes. This morning, in a dream, she's handed you an image under glass, a bale of hay in a field of darkness, burning.
The images in that are just stunning.
And they're actually all from the 7 giraffes and the image of a bale of hay burning and the woman herself. They all showed up in dreams and wanted to be put together into this one poem.
That's really remarkable. I read this in the book, The Sister from Below, and I remember when I was reading actually the covered wagon drawn by 7 giraffes, I thought, where on earth did that come from? And yet, I mean, it all comes from the same place. That is the psyche or the muse, which is really beautiful. I mean, just this poem alone could be the subject of meditation for me for days, if not weeks and months. There are just so many rich images in there. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's just been such a pleasure. I've been speaking with Naomi Ruth Lowinsky, and her book is The Sister from Below, When the Muse Gets Her Way. A stunning book. I really encourage you to check it out. And Naomi, you also have a blog at sisterfrombelow.com.
Right, I do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.